Patrick.
Hey, Michael J. Happy Thanksgiving, man.
Yeah, this is a very special Thanksgiving Day episode of the Top Level Podcast. I'm very thankful to be here talking to you.
Absolutely. And major thanks to John DeJong for supporting us on Patreon, and for everybody tuning in every week and sharing us on social media and generally kicking it with us every week.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much, John. I'm really thankful for all of our patrons and on all of our listeners. And I'm actually also thankful for the great figures of Magic that have helped put me where I am in just in mental space and ability to prepare for things. I've got an event I'm preparing for. I was just thinking about this recently. A long time ago, I used to prepare in I think a way that folks today might consider really atypical, because I think that people either like playing in local stores, play with their friends, play on MitGo, but I did this thing. I don't know if you ever did this. I would actually load up 2 Apprentice windows and play against myself. Did you ever do that?
Oh yeah.
So, and I did that a lot. I would do a 10-game set before work every morning if I was trying different decks. And when I told people this, sometimes they'd be like, "That's fake." I mean, what do you mean it's fake? It's like it's fake because you know what's in the other person's hand, because the other person is you. And I'm like, well, that's kind of true, right? But I also kind of get a feeling for both sides of the matchup because of this, and I found it to be really enriching and really helpful in learning how to tune decks. But the reason that I thought it wasn't fake, or the reason I thought it was compelling, is I don't even know if this story is true, but I know that I heard the story, and when I heard it, it made me want to do it. All right? It's a story that Eric Taylor told me about Kai Buddha. When everybody else in Kai's team wanted to go to sleep, right? But, going into a tournament, Kai just shook his head and he said, "You guys just don't want it enough." Sat down at his laptop and loaded up 2 Apprentice windows, and then grinded against himself when everyone else was asleep. And I was like, shoot, man, that's how you get to be the best player in the world, I guess. Right? And it was just a different level of technology back then. And it was inspiring to me, and I love to do it, and I wish I had the discipline to do this more.
Yeah, I think that the idea of playing against yourself, it can be such a valuable tool in all its different forms when used correctly. And I think one of the big problems, one of the challenges that you encounter with when people try to do this, if they don't do it right, one of the challenges that can happen is if the person is, for instance, it's a bad way to get results of a matchup, like to know that's not the purpose of something like that. You don't do it to see which side you can get to win. You do it to get a feel for the matchup or the pace or the way the cards draw. And I think that people who are intuitive are going to often they're going to value. There are people who are intuitive learners who are going to value that feeling versus, there's some people who are much more sensory focused, or they're just looking at the data numbers specifically. But I think that when you're a deck builder, there's a certain element that goes along with deck building when you're building a new kind of a deck, not just picking a deck from among successful ones. When you're trying an idea of yours, when you have a concept that you're working with, getting a feel for that. And it can sometimes even just be taking test draws. We've all done that. Been at the spot of taking test draws and seeing how the cards play out. But I think that having 2 different decks that are effectively taking test draws and walking through the motions, it's more than 4 times as good as taking test draws with 1 deck.
So here's something that I think might not be intuitive to some folks hearing about this for the first time, is that it's actually highly opportune to cheat when doing this format. So here's an example. When you're a deck designer and you're trying to build a deck that could attack a format, or to attack maybe a handful or a small number of existing archetypes, one of the things that you have to challenge yourself on is is my idea actually good enough? And you don't want to say like, oh well, if I put Shatters in my deck, it's obviously good enough against Affinity, right? Like that's a thing that some people say to themselves, and your mileage can vary on that kind of stuff. One of the things I would do would be, especially in sideboarded games, I would just give my deck the perfect hand. And then I would just take regular draws on the other side, and my deck better win every single, maybe not every single one, but an overwhelming number of the games that I gave it a perfect hand. Because if it doesn't win all the games that give it a perfect hand, it's not an idea worth exploring, at least for the purpose of that matchup.
So on that relates to kind of a controversial playtesting topic that I don't think there's a clear resolution for, and I think that it depends on how you think about things. But there is this idea of wanting to try an experimental approach. And then you're like, well, what if we literally just rig it and we put the Stony Silence in your hand? Do you even win?
Yeah, that's what I'm checking for.
Right. And I know a number of people who have sworn by this approach, and I believe them that they're getting benefit out of it. I don't think that it's an illusion. I think that there are times where people will propose a possible plan or idea and not know how it's going to work, and then when they play the games, they don't know if it would have mattered enough unless they really have it. I personally find more value in playing the games with just random collection, like play the game straight up. And this might also just be crutching on experience, but I can't help but when play imagine what it would be like if I would have had the card that I want. And I have found that rigging it to give yourself the card has a very distorting impact on how you play, how your opponent plays, or if you're playing against each other. Like it's not a clean example of the thing in action. And that said, I think that it does rely on an awful lot of things, like a lot of experience from how many times I've been in the position the other way. I think that it is worth exploring for people, trying a particular idea and seeing how it works. I think that the moment you start holding on to a specific outcome, like you have to win 90% of the time, or you should win almost all the time, that
you should win a lot. That's what I think. If you're not, so when I think that this is just a tool, right? So,
can I speak to the winning a lot part for a second?
Sure.
I actually think that is, you hit the nail on the head. Does it feel like you would win a lot? Like if you were to have this card, like for instance, you could do it the way that you're describing, give yourself that card, or two cards, or whatever it is, right? And a good mana draw, whatever. When you have that combination of cards, like rig it so that you got that hand, but then give the other deck a random hand.
Yeah.
And just play a bunch of the same game and see how it feels. And like if you're like, imagine you were behind horribly. Game one, you're 10% to win. And you're trying to turn around the matchup with 8 sideboard cards, 4 copies of 2 different cards. If you gave yourself one of each of those cards, you got to win an incredible amount of the games to be willing to justify 8 sideboard slots for a matchup where you're losing the first game. Because if you don't win 2 out of 3, you get very, very, very few bonus points for losing 2-1.
If you're only winning 70% of the time, think about it like this. You're only winning 70% of the time in the sideboarded games where you have access to these 8 cards. You don't even have positive win expectation for the match. That's actually the direction I would be coming from on this. One of it depends on 2 things. Number one, how frequently do you think you're going to be in this matchup, right? So if you're in a format like the current standard, right, when black, green, and blue, white are overwhelmingly popular relative to other decks, or at least overwhelmingly popular relative to other decks that are in the top 8, right, that are showing up every week.
Or the top 32.
Yeah, in the winner's circle. Yeah, the top 32, my God, right now. Like, if these are the kind of decks you're playing against and you don't have a good matchup in game one, if your sideboard doesn't get you past 70%, if you're drawing your sideboard cards, you're just not going to be able to have a positive win expectation there. So,
well, you actually have to go quite a bit further because that 70%,
that's 49%. So
right, you got to be better.
Games.
You got to be better than 70% like per game.
Yeah.
You're not going to draw your sideboard cards every game.
80% gives you only a not too much of an advantage in a 3-game set, which is, you need to win a lot. Like,
and so if you have 4 copies each of these two, if you have 8 sideboard slots that you're dedicating to a matchup that you get blown out game 1, you better be doing just incredible with. Now that said, if your 8 cards are 4 copies of Leyline of the Void and 4 copies of Ravenous Trap or whatever,
yeah,
and you put 1 Ravenous Trap and 1 Leyline of the Void in your hand,
that's not fair. It's not.
No, it's that, but it actually speaks to the type of thing. I mean, not every matchup is going to be 10% game 1.
Well, what's real interesting though? If you're actually interested in seeing how the other side does, also not just polling if your brew works. I talked. When Jamie Park came back, right? Was it 2007? I want to say when Jamie came back, he played Dredge at Grand Prix Philadelphia. Same one that you played. You debuted Vendilion Click, I want to say. Steve Sadin was like
in 2008, right?
2008, is that right?
No, was it? Yeah, I think it was 2008.
2007 or 2008, one of the two.
It was 2008 because Morning Tide was out.
Okay, so you debuted Vendilion Click. I remember this Grand Prix like vividly. Jamie got back on the Pro Tour. He didn't make top 8, but he got back on the Pro Tour with Dredge. And I would bet it's important for a Dredge player to be able to know in sideboarded games. Let's assume that you've got some kamikazes on the other side of the table who have got a bunch of Tormod's Crypts, a bunch of ley lines. They're coming after you because they know that you're the boogeyman. How do you win with your echoing truth or your chain of vapor, right? Like, how many sideboard cards do you need to beat their sideboard cards? That's an interesting question, right? Like, it's a moving target on both sides.
Yeah, like I've appreciated times where, like, Dredge is one of the most famous for doing this, where you adopt a sideboard plan where you're just you accept you're going to lose certain types of games, and you're not going to, like,
Scott stuff.
Right, like, there's just nothing you can do that's worth the space, but you're picking this strategy partially because you're betting that circumstance won't come up often enough to be worth doing anything about it.
Well, also you're betting because you've got to feel like you've got an overwhelming likelihood to win game 1, right? Like, if you think you're winning game 1 sight unseen across the table 70% of the time, that's a lot of reason to want to play a strategy that packs half a dozen different sideboard cards.
Yep. Manaless Dredge in Vintage?
I know this deck.
Yeah, I've enjoyed. There's been some times where people have played so the strategy just use no mana, just 4 Bazaar of Baghdad's. Sometimes a strip mine, but basically 4 Bazaar of Baghdad's, and you mulligan to the death. You always are going to get Bazaar, even if it kills you. Some percentage of the time you lose at the beginning because you mulligan to 1, and it's just not Bazaar. But the point is that their deck can't cast any spells, really. I mean, they have some spells they can play. They don't cost any mana, but like Unmask or something. But for the most part, they're not playing with any cards that you cast. Besides, Leyline of the Void, Chalice of the Void, stuff that doesn't cost mana. But their sideboard, sometimes people would play sideboards where the sideboard is just like 8 cards or 7 cards that produce mana. 7 or 8 cards that produce mana, and 7 or 8 cards that destroy Leyline of the Void for 1 mana. Done. That's literally the entire sideboard is just that.
So, I don't know if you
And
remember.
that's a 2-card combo. It's a 2-card combo.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember this far back. It was like, I want to say 2005, 2006. So I played this deck Friggerid that John friggin' Rizzo made, right?
Oh,
But I played it the second week before anyone had ever heard of the deck. So Osip Levitovich played it in, like, because he knew Rizzo or something. He played it in, like, a side event at a Pro Tour. And he's just like, you just play this deck, you'll be back on the Pro Tour, right? So the deck is relentlessly good in game one. But it was, like, horrendous against certain kind of beatdown decks. This wasn't a refined strategy yet, right? Like, we don't
Well, this was the first dredge
This
deck.
is the first time anyone ever
This is a dredge
iterated
deck
yeah,
so early on. This is a dredge deck when one of the cards you're playing is Moss Dog.
So
3/3 for 4.
But we had like the cards. My sideboard, you wouldn't even believe this sideboard. It was like a bunch of Riftstone. What's the name of the land that if it goes to the graveyard, any of your lands get tapped?
Riftstone Portal.
So I had a bunch of Riftstone portals to side in so I could cast spells instead of just discarding my cards, right? Because like the baseline strategy is like sometimes you just go up to 8, discard a Golgari Grave Troll, and then start dredging Icarids, right? Like that's like one of the things you did sometimes. So I decided like 4 Riftstone portals just to cast spells, but they tapped for green or white, so I could tap them for Oxidize or Kataki. Because my sideboard was like Riftstone Portal, Oxidize, and Kataki. And I don't remember what the other card was. Like, probably, I don't know, something that was not good against the Rock deck that beat me because he had a second turn, whether, with BB, 1, remove a card from your graveyard. Weathered Witch or something.
Yep.
Yeah, so.
Withered
Wretch, yeah. I had no response to his sideboard card. But, like, yeah, but, so, like, I played against Affinity a bunch in that tournament, and all I would do was just like mulligan until I would get like some ability to cast Kataki. Like it was absurd. You're just like first turn like Mox, Riftstone Portal, Kataki, and then you spent the rest of the game tapping the Mox to pay for the Kataki, which is kind of silly. But it was crippling to me, but way more crippling to them. Just get in for 2 a bunch. That was that was the early days of Golgari Grave Troll.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit too of the strategies V chose for his solution deck in Japan way back in the day, where it's you make the main deck beat 2 matchups. Like let's say you set your main deck up to have 2 good matchups and 1 bad one. And then the entire sideboard, like a lot of the sideboard, is going to be good against the other one ostensibly, and you're not going to worry about the fringe because you think that it's mostly a 3-deck or a 2-deck format or whatever.
Well, yeah, that was like a block format, so it was much more predictable, like how many decks you'd have to be playing against.
I mean, it's like in Tempest block, in testing for the Tempest only Pro Tour, and I'm not talking about like all 3 sets, Tempest only.
Dave Price's Pro Tour.
Dave Price. And Ben Rubin busting onto the scene as a wee lad, his first top 8 as I don't know, was he like 14 at the time or something? Crazy, 15.
He must have been 16 by then.
No, I don't think so. He was either 14 or 15, I think.
He was already well known to be a prodigy by Worlds that year.
Of course, I mean the search for Bobby Fischer, the search for Ben Rubin. So
we found him. It didn't take very long.
So. That Pro Tour, one of the strategies that I thought was really cool was with Bottle Gnomes Corpse Dance. People would there would be different strategies where people would rely on using Corpse Dance and Bottle Gnomes over and over and over again to gain enough life to actually be able to get ahead of Cursed Scroll or beat a red aggro deck. And one of the things that you would do sometimes is come up with a strategy where, like for instance, let's say your deck is a Living Death deck, and you have Living Death and Intuition and Tradewind Rider, and you can, if somebody is not playing a red aggro deck, you can just overpower them because Tradewind Rider and Living Death are more powerful than whatever they're doing. And then if you can rely on overpowering people who aren't doing the thing you're afraid of, sometimes you can go to great lengths to try to address the thing that you're afraid of but like using a bunch of bottle gnomes and corpse dances and stuff that goes on a, like for instance, there have been times in Standard where people have crutched on, I'll just overpower people with Elspeth or Gideon or Jace, or they're using a bunch of powerful planeswalkers when other people don't have cards that powerful. Or in Modern, when people just be like, oh, if my opponent's playing a fair strategy, I'll just beat them with my Tarmogoyfs and my Lilianas and my whatever, right? But then you go really, really, really hard on the area that is your weakness, and you are willing to play what it takes to address that other weakness, and then you'll just count on overpowering the people who aren't vulnerable to that. Like maybe you have a bunch of Ancient Grudges and Katakis and Timely Reinforcements or whatever the stuff is, and you're like, and if all that if that stuff isn't the stuff that beats them, well, then I'll just rely on my Ajani, Torrential Gearhulk, Snapcaster Maid. I'll just try to use powerful cards to beat them.
So what was the deck from the Ben Rubin Tempest that you're just talking about Living Death versus?
Yeah, Ben Rubin's Living Death deck. Dude, that Pro Tour, I played Metallic Sliver at that Pro Tour. And Horn Sliver? Yes.
Brian Schneider, was he like 9th in that Pro Tour? Is that right?
I'm not sure. I would believe it.
I want to say because you guys had, and I remember Randy told me after the Pro Tour.
Maybe it was 11th. I don't know. He was top 16.
Randy told me after the Pro Tour that the big innovation was that you guys had figured out that Canopy Spider was better than Bottle Gnomes against Red, which I would have never. That was not intuitive to me at all.
Yeah, coming down on turn 2 was just so sick. But then you also sometimes chump block Wrathy Dragon. And
it had reach.
Wasn't it just a 1/3 reach for 2?
I mean, now that I say it had reach out loud like a buffoon, I realize it must have had reach. It was a spider. Like, no one would have just played a 1/3 for 2, right? Would they?
No, they wouldn't.
Yeah, so chump blocking Wrathy Dragon seems awesome. But a 1/3 in a format where there's a high expectation of a Jackal Pup being played on the first turn seems pretty awesome, actually.
Well, yeah, and part of it is the fact that the most important thing outside of the cost. The cost is a big, big deal. But the most important thing outside of the cost is actually the fact that it's not an artifact. Because every red deck in the world would have disenchants, or shatters, really. They'd have shatters. Because every deck in the format was full of curse scrolls. And when you spend 3 mana on your Bottle Gnome, and they spend 2 mana on their shatter, even though you're up 3 life, their crackback will often do 4 or 5 damage, right? Like they have like a giant strength on a Jackal Pup, right? If they go Jackal Pup and then they go giant strength on it, and then they shatter your Bottle Gnome, you're falling further and further behind. And even though giant strength gets past the Canopy Spider in this instance, you have whatever your other cards are. If their shatter is sitting in their hand not doing anything, they're down a card that could have been another attacker. And the combination of not being vulnerable to artifact kill with the fact that it just costs 2, Canopy Spider was some of the best tech for that Pro Tour. So good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the stuff that ends up being really innovative coming out of testing is just the kind of stuff that is non-intuitive but is revealed over the course of, like somebody has an idea and then you just grind it a bunch. Like if I just said to you, oh, it turns out that Canopy Spider is better than Bottle Gnomes in this format, where Bottle Gnomes is like the widely accepted solution to Jackal Pup, right? I think you could think about that for a second and be like, oh, I could see how that would happen. And the reason is because it costs less mana. And the secondary reason that you have about it being not an artifact is actually quite meaningful in context, but it's just not intuitive. I was actually thinking about, I was kind of tying it back to playing against yourself and playtesting. Do you remember the green-white deck that Brian Kibler used to make top 8 of U.S. Nationals? I think it's like 2004. The Decree of Justice deck, Eternal Dragon,
yep.
Chromas. Yeah, so that deck, the reason that it was good, I think, like among all other reasons, the reason it was good is an overwhelming Game 1 matchup against Affinity. Like, way over 75% against Affinity in Game 1. And, like, also an awesome matchup against Goblins. So if there were two decks you wanted to beat in that format, it was Affinity and Goblins, right? But the thing, this took so much, like, I would just hit my head against the computer screen. It took me so long to just, like, to accept that this was true. You know, like, at some point I think Zvi told me to, this is taking from another game, but Zvi told me to stop playing Aces and Kings because I didn't have the discipline to play it. And when he told me to do that, I actually, like, got better. And so I just eventually had to learn the discipline to not oxidize my opponent's first land. So there's just like, if I had two oxidize, or I could oxidize into disenchant of some kind in my hand, you're just like, oh, just gonna mana screw them. They're gonna get destroyed. If there was one way you could lose the game as the green-white deck against Affinity, it was by trying to Stone Rain them. And it seems so weird because you're spending 1 mana to Stone Rain them. What could be more powerful than that? But you just let them catch up. And what ends up happening is their threats are so cheap. Their Thoughtcast is only 1 mana. If they get any amount of artifacts in play, Arcbound Ravager is so deadly. The other thing is that if they get a Disciple of the Vault down before you can oxidize them, you should actually start taking damage from destroying their lands. And then you just don't have a disenchant later for their key threat because you used it on their stupid Ancient Den or whatever. And so, like, that's the kind of thing I played.
That's the exact same thing as the Bitter Blossom Esper Charm. When Bucher and I, Manuel Bucher, one of the originators of 5-color control back in the day, we're playtesting Fairies versus 5-color, and it was a quantum leap when we got to the place of realizing you don't Esper Charm their Bitter Blossom. Now, this is not without some caveats. There's certain places and times and scenarios for that particular matchup, but the reason that at the time
sometimes
Esper Charm,
right? Like if they have like a Vial of Life and you don't have any other cards.
But so in context, the prevailing wisdom was that the reason 5-color control couldn't beat the reason Fairies was good against 5-color control was because the turn 2 Bitter Blossom was just so unbeatable that you got enough percentage. It was so hard. And so the intuitive thing to people is, of course, you use your Esper Charm to destroy Bitter Blossom because that's one of the modes it can do is destroy the card that is the best card against you. But, and we're talking about on turn 3, where you just go turn 3, Esper Charm, Bitter Blossom. What we realized is you don't want to do that. No, even though it's so tempting, you almost always don't really actually want to do it in that position, the turn 3. So here are a couple of reasons why. When you Esper Charm to draw 2, you're drawing cards that you can trade for your opponent's stuff. You're relying on your extra cards to keep up with them, and your cards are powerful. When you have stuff like Volcanic Fallout or Plume Veil or whatever, Broodmate Dragon, any number of things, whatever it is you have access to, those cards are how you're trying to actually play a game against the Fairy deck, and you can draw more cards than your opponent and have something else going for you, and their life total keeps ticking down. You can make the game sharper and dynamic.
The Fairy deck in Standard didn't have any good way to gain life, as I recall, did it?
Wall of Reverence.
The Fairy deck.
Oh, the Fairy deck? No, they played 0. So, when you'd actually Esper Charm the Bitter Blossom, you're trading 2 cards.
Was this the I just want to make sure I'm imagining the right deck. Is this the Bloodbraid Elf deck or a different?
No. Long before that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is like Gab Nassif wins the Pro Tour in Yokohama.
Oh, the Volcanic
or Kyoto
deck.
So, but we did it. We actually played 5-color control at all the different events, so that wasn't like even the first one. But it's that era. So
no, I'm just thinking, because the Bloodbraid Elf deck was the coolest one, I thought. But
yeah, but it was a very different deck.
That's why I'm asking which one.
Right. So the point is that when you Esper Charm to destroy Bitter Blossom, you're you're hymn to Taraking yourself. You turn their Bitter Blossom into a hymn to Tarak, because you don't have 2 random cards, and they spent 2 mana. But what's worse is that you spent 3 mana for the privilege of getting him to Turok. You see, Fairies is a very efficient deck. If you spend 3 mana to get rid of their 2 mana play, you're already doing bad things. And that's not even counting the possibility that if they go turn 2 Bitter Blossom, you play your second land, they play their third land. On your third turn, they already have a fairy token that they're up. And when you try to destroy the Bitter Blossom, they go Scion of Una.
Yeah, so that would counter the Esper Charm.
Right. So all that is just super bad.
Barf.
But even when you're on the play and you can destroy their Bitter Blossom before they even get a token, and they can use the Scion while they're tapped out, still don't
wrong.
Do it. So in that spot.
I believe you because I respect your experience. I would just have never come to that conclusion by myself, I don't think.
So when you are on the play, you're already down a card. And if you draw 2, you don't even have to discard to hand size. You want to hit all your land drops and start blasting Cryptic Commands and Cruel Ultimatums and Broodmate Dragons, because the way you win that matchup is by playing powerful cards and not dying to Mistbind Click. So as long as you can, like, Broken Ambitions or Terror the Mistbind Click or whatever, you eventually Volcanic Fallout, but you're Volcanic Fallouting just to buy time. And you're Plume Veiling just to buy time. When you start just dropping bombs where you go, you go turn 3, Esper Charm to draw 2 to make sure you can hit your land drops, turn 4, Plume Veil, turn 5, sweep the board, turn 6, Broodmate Dragon, turn 7, Cruel Ultimatum, whatever it is. And this isn't to suggest that you could board out stuff if you want, but like expensive stuff. But that's at a baseline in game 1. Not only do you not want to waste 3 mana doing this thing, you actually are making their second Bitter Blossom go from being nearly dead or weak to being the best card they could possibly have. And I think that's an underrated experience.
That's really
in gameplay.
You create a swing for them.
Right, because normally, like when you're playing Fairies, you snap keep hands with 2 Bitter Blossoms in that era. Even though the second Bitter Blossom, you might not be able to play. In some matchups, you would play it. In some matchups, you wouldn't. Normally, if somebody played a second Bitter Blossom against 5-card control, it's a mistake, because you're going to make yourself particularly vulnerable to Volcanic Fallouts and Cloud Thresher or Plume Veil, or like all the different elements. Like when you are when you're intensifying the life loss so quickly, the amount of upside you get from Bitter Blossom doesn't scale as fast as the amount of downside from the second copy. Now, there's some matchups where you would play the second copy,
like the Mirror,
yeah, or even some situations, like plenty of situations in the 5-color games, just not on turn 2 into turn 3 the majority of the time. You would be setting yourself up for disaster. You want to be advancing your board, and the second one is a backup. But if somebody Esper Charms a Bitter Blossom, the second card that was almost dead or frequently dead is now the best card in their deck. You've upped the value so much. A good way to think of it is when somebody disenchants your Necropotence. It's like, okay, I don't know what you think you're trying to accomplish, buddy, but suddenly you just took, you think I don't have 3 other copies of Necropotence?
But I was just going to draw an extra card. That's what's so funny. You just get a card when they do that. That's
right.
Wait, you get 2 cards, right? Like you get their disenchant, and then you just get a draw step, and then you do your thing again.
And your Necropotence was dead, and now it's a good card.
It's actually so pleasant. I remember watching Randy play. I just sit behind Randy in the era when he won Chicago '97, and he was a top Pro Tour player for a while. And I just would watch how he played Necro. He was so conservative around the card Necropotence to a degree I'd never seen anyone play. You know, like, he would spend all of his like demonic consultations to get a backup Necropotence under the belief that someone would get rid of his first Necropotence or force him. This was just a non-intuitive line from my perspective. You know, like, that he would take the mana out in his first couple of turns to ensure that he was going to get a Necropotence rather than, you know, do a more proactive play. He did it very consistently. I don't know. It was very good, so I assume it was right.
I can believe it. I think that this general space, though, that we're talking about of changing the quality of your opponent's cards, it's one that gets overlooked sometimes. Like when your opponent has, let's say your opponent just has a whole bunch of lightning bolts, and your deck doesn't have any creatures at all. If you add into your deck a bunch of I don't know, Dark Confidants, for instance. Let's say you're sideboarding.
Let me steal this.
Oh, Abrupt Decay was okay. Go ahead. You get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I do, and I actually want to ask you how you approach these situations. I have very consistently approached these situations in a very consistent way for as long as Dark Confidant has been an available card in a bunch of different formats. And it turns out being right a lot of the time. I think it turns out being right more often than not, and it's certainly not right all the time, though, right? So, just as an easy example that I think most of the listeners can relate to, you ever over one of those games where your opponent plays a Dark Confidant, you bolt it. Your opponent plays a Dark Confidant, you bolt it. Your opponent plays a Dark Confidant, you bolt it. You're out of bolts, and if you had just let him have his Dark Confidants, those bolts would have killed him.
Oh yeah,
like I think that's incredibly common. For to be in that situation. So I've taken, I think, a very, very I don't know what word to use, like liberal maverick sort of position against Dark Confidant always, which is that I assume that the Dark Confidant's going to kill my opponent, and so I play in such a way to make my opponent die to the Dark Confidant. And you have to have a certain amount of steel in your stomach for this, because you're giving up card advantage, which is like the first thing that you learn as a baby Magic player is to maximize card advantage. And I'm talking about in black-white decks, you know, in like green-blue decks. The Dark Confidant's going to kill him. He's going to help us out. We just got to help him. We help him get us where he wants to go, which is a dead opponent, right? And the only exception would be if you're playing a control deck. I think I would want to get rid of a Dark Confidant typically. But
see, I appreciate the sentiment. I think that there is a combination of two things going on. One, there's a biasing because of the types of decks you're playing.
Yeah, I mean,
for instance, when you play a Splinter Twin deck, and your deck has Lightning Bolt in it, kill the Dark Confidant. Like, your plan isn't to not. It's not like you're going to try to suddenly make the game about killing them with their own Dark Confidant.
Sure.
It's different when you're playing a black-white deck that has Lingering Souls and lots of aggression, Tight House Scholar. Like, if you have like a whole bunch of. If you're a proactive, aggressive deck that cares about the damage, the second thing is that I think that you're probably a little bit crutching on. It's a much more complicated puzzle than that, and I would guess that heuristic is not as universally right as it is universally right for you to prioritize that because of the biases that it is helping correct for.
So I would definitely say that I would guess kill the Dark Confidants sometimes, right?
Right, of course.
But my general tendency is to let the Dark Confidants live for the reason I said, and I think part of it is, I think that when the opponents play the Dark Confidant, that the opponents often don't consider enough how much damage the Dark Confidants are going to do to themselves, because they expect their opponents to kill the Dark Confidants, and that's actually, it affects the gameplay, right? So, it just when Dark Confidant might have been potentially at it's hard to say at its apex. It's one of the greatest cards that's ever been printed, right? At a 2-mana creature, but at Proto Charleston in teams, we played 2 black decks, I think, on my team, and neither of us played Dark Confidant. And I remember Mark Herberholz played like a very fast black-white deck, and I played a slow black-white deck at that Pro Tour. And he's just like, I heard you're undefeated. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, can I see your black-white deck? And I showed him, and he's just like, your deck has Glean Crawler and not Dark Confidant. And I'm like, it does in fact have Glean Crawler and not Dark Confidant. Like,
not a great flip to Dark Confidant, I might add.
like, and he's just like, he's like, first he's just like, he's being Mark. He's like, he's like, you got to be silly that you're playing Glean Crawler and instead of Dark Confidant. He's like, and he's like, well, can you explain to me why you guys would choose to do this? And I was like, look, the problem is I have all these cards like Ghost Council of Orzhova in my deck, right? Like, and you don't want to flip that with your Dark Confidant. And the games are the threats were so powerful, right? If you're playing against like and I had what I got, like Wave of Reckoning in my deck, and like all different kinds of wraths and expensive, like a Skeletal Vampire,
right? Big bombs and cards that just radically impact the board in the game.
Like, when I beat Raphael Levy, I went like Skeletal Vampire, Wave of Reckoning. Like, and he was in a commanding position, and I was like, if I were playing like Dark Confidant and Shrieking Gargoyle, I would just get blown out by his 7/7 hexproof creatures, like. That you can attack the format in a bunch of different angles, but we came in thinking that everyone was going to have powerful cards. And there's not enough small, cheap removal that you can possibly play that would deal with the threats that we thought we would be playing against, right? Like, there's no number of shocks or whatever the shock proxy was in the format to deal with somebody who just has, like, an active...
Oh, there's 10.
There's 10... Shock.
10. If you had 10 shocks, then you could just go shock, 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 shock.
Well, I was
shock,
saying, like that in the format. I'm saying where you would be able to actually compete with somebody who had a Glarib Subdual and an active Vidogazi the City Tree, right? Like, you're just going to lose to that guy if your plan is to try to beat him with small cards. And so we just had to try to go bigger. And you can't play Dark Confidant if your deck is full of 6s and 7s. So that's just. One thing about Dark Confidant.
Yeah, and actually, I think Dark Confidant has historically been one of the biggest, players involved in the making their second one from turning their second one from a bad card into a great card. Because when your opponent has a Dark Confidant and you attack, and if you trade off your Mutavault for their Dark Confidant. Then they just play another Dark Confidant, and they're happy. They're like, yes, they didn't want a second Dark Confidant a lot of the time. Sometimes you do, obviously, but there's plenty of decks where most of the time you don't actually want to be riding two Dark Confidants at the same time, and they manage to get a sinkhole of your best land out of it, right? But sometimes you look at their hand and you see they have multiple Dark Confidants. You don't even get rid of them, and you don't pick either one. You thought sees the Liliana or whatever. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in Pro Tours that I have gone after my opponent's hand aggressively, taken their kill spells so that they can't kill their own Dark Confidant.
Oh, my favorite story from that Pro Tour Charleston was Patrick Sullivan actually won a match where his Dark Confidant flipped over Hit Run, right? So Hit Run costs 8, right? So the hit was 3, and then the run is 5, and his deck couldn't cast the run side, so he's just playing just for hit. He flips over Hit Run, takes 8 himself, and then immediately hits his own Dark Confidant, taking further damage. And I just watch him play it, and I'm like, this is just the dumbest thing I've ever seen. He's like, and I won. He's like, sometimes you got to hit your own Dark Confidant. What if I flipped over another Hit Run?
Your Dark Confidant hits Hit Run, and then you Hit Run your Dark Confidant. 9
damage to kill 2 of his own best cards in order to stay in the game. It's just hilarious,
Yep.
But I will tell you, one time that I always killed my opponent's Dark Confidant was in Extended a few years ago. When you could play Dark Confidant and Jace the Mind Sculptor at the same time, you should kill the Dark Confidant.
Oh, yeah.
I will tell you right now.
Also, here's another one. In Legacy,
yeah,
you gotta have to just kill Dark Confidant.
Oh, because of Brainstorms and Jace the Mind Sculptor.
And Ponder, everything.
Yeah, so those 4
Plus, also in Legacy, it's not... whatever you're thinking, That's not what it's gonna. It's not. If you think that they're Dark Confidant, it's like, oh, I guess they flip over. They're like, I took 2 damage from Tarmogoyf, the most expensive card in my deck.
So, let me ask you a legacy question. I asked Drew Levin this question once, and I was just dazzled by his answer. Okay, like, so you unknown opponent, you sit down, they go first turn Misty Rainforest. What deck do you put them on?
Well, I think I would need to know what format, what context.
I don't know. It's just a general.
Current nowadays Legacy.
Yeah.
If they play Misty Rainforest,
First turn Misty Rainforest. They don't do anything with it. You just play it.
What do I put them on? Like, am I Cabal Therapying them?
Well, I mean, you have to. They're going first, right? And then you're gonna have to decide how to play your hand. And in Legacy,
Do I have a Cabal Therapy?
You don't have a Cabal Therapy. You just.
What is it? I'm deciding. Okay, what's my deck?
You're playing a medium beatdown deck.
What do you mean
I don't know why you're playing a
hell is
medium beatdown deck, but
I don't know what a medium beatdown deck is.
All right, you have like lightning bolts and some guys. And some
Am I playing blue cards?
You are playing blue cards.
Okay, so I'm just playing
It's
3 colors
Legacy,
of
Patrick. We haven't gone crazy.
So I don't know. Your example doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'm playing a 3-color good strategy. I put my opponent on Misty Rainforest.
No, but you're not going to make a prediction on his deck.
Why would I? What's the context? Do I have a card in my hand that requires predicting what his deck is?
Yeah, like you could play like a first turn Ponder, or you could play first turn Nothing, leaving up Brainstorm, but also leaving up Spell Pierce, maybe. Maybe this is
I don't know.
a terrible game.
It probably is. Is the punchline that I assume he's playing Storm or something?
Well, no. Like I asked Drew, and Drew said if he goes like Misty Rainforest Nothing, I put him on Rug Delver. So I said, yeah, I put him on Rug Delver too. And then as he did Nothing, on a secondary he played a second Misty Rainforest and passed. And I said, what deck did you put him on? He's like, he's definitely a blue combo deck. And I said, he was definitely a blue combo deck, but I kept him on Rug Delver, so I lost, right? So, like, I had the opportunity to alter my flow at that point, but I was like, oh no, he's Rug Delver, when he did nothing for the first 2 turns. But he's like, no. If he's fetch land pass 2 in a row, he's definitely a blue combo deck. And Drew was correct. I kept him on Rug Delver in my imagination, and I was punished for it by being killed.
What were you imagining his Rug Delver deck to be doing if it didn't play any cards on the first or second turn?
I couldn't tell you. I'm not really a Legacy expert. So.
What was he saving up for?
Well, I don't know. I just thought like maybe like he was gonna cast a Brainstorm and then play a Tarmogoyf for the next turn or something. I don't know what these Rug Delver guys do. I was wrong. The party is very clearly wrong. He was a blue combo deck. So it doesn't even matter which one. I think it was probably High Tide. But he defeated.
I definitely, I don't know if it's completely the exact same, but it's at the very least related to the playing of lands and not updating priors. But when I was playing this mono red deck in New York a few years ago, I'm just playing Snow-Covered Mountain, Snow-Covered Mountain, Snow-Covered Mountain against Adam Yurchik, who's playing a mono blue morph deck, like Pickles or whatever, with Vesuvian Shapeshifter and Brine Elemental.
I know this deck. And
he was like, I was playing in such a way. I mean, this is before news, like the word had really spread about the Dragonstorm deck, and he assumed that I was playing like I correctly anticipated that he would assume that I was likely playing Skred Red, some sort of stuffy doll Skred mid-rangey red board control deck.
So you're going to play your first spell on turn 6 or something? Is that the...
Because I just go Snow-Covered Mountain, Snow-Covered Mountain, Snow-Covered Mountain. And all I'm doing is playing Snow-Covered Mountains. And it was helpful that I didn't have any other plays to be making. But like I actually, the turn before, like when I got to a critical spot where he was going to have enough mana to play his morph and still have Cryptic Command up or whatever, I intentionally did not play the storage land that I had drawn, and instead played yet another Snow-Covered Mountain, because I was trying to make sure that I was keeping... I wasn't going to have time to charge anyway. I was ready to go for it, and I just needed to make sure that he tapped some mana and he wasn't suspicious. It's like all he has to do is tap 3 mana, and I'll be good.
The path is clear.
Right. So he plays his morph, and he's ready. You know, he plays his morph thinking I'm just playing Shred Red, and he'd already waited a long time. Because the moment that
So he has a Cryptic Command up or something?
Well, yeah, because part of it is that I needed him to not keep playing his morphs out early, because if I use all my burn spells killing his morphs, I won't be able to storm combo off. But he eventually drops his morph, and he's ready to do the whole thing. You know, he's like, oh, I'm establishing control. And then it was at that point that I drew, and I asked him what his life total was. He said 20, and then I tar fired him. And he's just got in play a morph face down with mana open, cards in hand. And it was at that moment he looked me in the eye. He's like, he just looks up, like he was already ready to bin his guy. And he had waited. You know what it was? He waited till he got 11 or 10. He waited till he was going to be able to just flip the Brine Elemental immediately, right? But he was ready to pick up his Brine Elemental. And I say, Tarfire you. And it was at that point he looks up, looks me in the eye, and says, I've made a terrible mistake.
That's the best. There's nothing better than that.
Oh, yeah. And then obviously just unload all the rest of my burn spells. And there's nothing for him to counter. What can he counter, right? Like, is he going to counter a Tarfire? That's 2 damage, and then the Storm counts 1 higher. So we just,
what did you
play
have,
a whole bunch. It was like I'm just building up for, like, I also have Pyromancer Swath Grape Shot, and I have Dragonstorm, and it's just, there's nothing he can do at this point, because by the time I play any cards that are worth countering, they're not worth countering because they have Storm. No, that was a good time, though, but just, that look he gave me when, like, he just looks up and he doesn't even know what's going on anymore, but he knows it's already over.
You and I are both magicians who love blue. Like, we love different things that are blue, different kinds of blue cards. We love them. But I think that I can speak for myself on this. I think you feel the same way based on the story you just told. I love figuring out how to beat people who have, like, 7 counterspells in their hand. Like, that's, like, one of my favorite things in Magic. Like, there's a pressure point that I can push on here, and I'm going to be victorious if I do this thing.
I mean, I was, way back in the day, one of the people who absolutely just loved the Drago. Like, I could play Drago like you wouldn't believe. I loved so much the fact that for a while back then, there just weren't that many people who could play the test of wills involved in discarding counterspells instead of casting spells. It's like, I know my opponent has all these counterspells. I'm just going to not play cards either. And we're going to both discard to hand size. And we're going to sculpt the perfect hand. And eventually I'll have 8 cards because it'll be my turn and my opponent will only have 7. And even though my opponent's hand is like mana drain, mana drain, mana drain, mana drain, counterspell, whatever, they don't have 14 blue in play. So they lose, even though they have all these counterspells. I love so much playing against people who have all these counterspells. I agree with you. There's a certain pleasure to it. And they think they have it all under control, and you have to take such a long view sometimes, or such a sideways approach sometimes, where, like I've enjoyed, like, there have been some times and some formats in the past where I've enjoyed missing my land drop when I've got several land in my hand.
Oh, the old Chad Ellis.
The Chad. Oh, yes, yeah, yes.
Chad Ellis with the High Tide deck did that because he had no action, right? But he fooled his opponent to think he had fully counter spells by discarding. So, I remember the first match. I think you were there actually. The first match I ever met Adrian Sullivan. So I was playing Prosbloom, and Adrian was playing a blue-green counterspell deck. And I remember, it was like we had never met in person before, but we were friendly from the internet. And, it was kind of an experience playing against him, and he would just say things out loud like, that's not doing anything, or like, and then we had accumulated a crowd, right? Like Bob Maher was there and watching us play. And I just remember, like, I realized at some point, because Adrian kept hitting his land drops, that Adrian was going to play from a position of strength because he keeps hitting his land drops. what else do you want to do when you're a blue control deck but hit your land drops, right? But I had realized what he didn't realize was that he kept hitting his land drops, but he only had like 4 blue in play, and that all of his other lands were green. And I was just like, oh, like there's a huge opportunity here at some point. And then I was able to test spell through like a counterspell wall, because at some point his lands didn't actually tap to cast any of the spells in his hand. But then the punchline is I ended up losing that game because I didn't have enough cards left in my library to win at the point that I had executed. I had to try to.
I've heard better punchlines. But actually, the note that you're getting at there is actually a very salient one at times. Whenever it's an important one that comes up from time to time about when you're playing against counterspells, pacing based on your opponent's land. Like one of the great examples of this historically was Counterspell. So back in the day, obviously Counterspell, blue, counter target spell. Counterspell, the old school Counterspell, would it's very powerful and could stop whatever you're doing. But there would be times where you play when your opponent has let me give an example. If you have 3 land and your opponent has 2 islands, that's a bad time to play your Hypnotic Spectre and get it counterspelled. But when your opponent has 3, but if you're on the play and your opponent has 3 islands, or a Tundra island, whatever, if your opponent has 3 lands and you have Black Knight and Hymn to Turok, and you have Hypnotic Spectre, instead of playing the Hypnotic Spectre, you play either Black Knight or Hymn to Turok, knowing that your opponent, if they counter it, can't counter the other one. Or likewise, if you have 3 land and your opponent has if you have 3 land and your opponent has 3 land, that might be a good time to, on their end step, play a burn spell. Like, actually, this comes up in Modern even now. If you're playing a Lava Spike deck, like your Naya Burn, Boros Burn, anything like that, if you're playing a burn deck, it's very important when you're playing against some of these blue decks, particularly like, Quarry style blue, any of the blue decks that have a bunch of counter spells at times, though, where that they have like Cryptic Command. They have whatever it is they have, Counter Squall, Dispel. You don't necessarily know the exact mix, but you can keep track of how many blue land they have in play. And if you play your burn spells at times that are the least opportune for them, that's actually a big part of how you beat a Grixis deck with a burn deck, is things like when they have 3 land, you play your burn spell, because no counter spell they could play is actually meaningfully giving them an advantage over you. But you don't just play, like if your opponent's at 14 and they have 4 land, that is not the time to play into a Cryptic Command, right?
Well, it depends. If you can try to get them to cast a Cryptic, they're not going to Cryptic Command at the end of their turn, right? Like they're passing.
If I'm at 14, I would.
You have 4 land. You're 14.
But but I wouldn't if I'm at 5. You see,
I guess there's nothing I can do that's meaningful. That's so meaningful on my own turn. Maybe that punishes you for countering me and drawing a card.
Right, exactly. None of your individual cards matter that much. But if you just wait now, eventually you can start to restock up your hand. You usually don't want to just discard to hand size, right? But like if you only have 3 cards in your hand because you already used some burn spells, and they got 5 cards, that's not the time to just fire off a Boros Charm just to get out of your hand.
No, you got
start stocking up.
You got to create a situation where you can have some kind of an advantage, because they have an advantage right now, right? If you're talking about a situation where they're above 0 life, right, so they're still alive, and they've got 2 more cards than you, then they've got 4 land in play. Already, if they can cast cards that cost more than 2, whatever cards they're casting are probably more meaningful than anything you can do. It's the horrendous situation for you as a burn player is if you go to 5 lands, let's say, and they just play a Tazagur and have like 4 lands open at that point, you could be in a lot of trouble. It's like an actual clock now.
I actually related on the burn stuff.
there are times, and it's less so with the popularity of Dispel now, but there have been times where the burn player will have spells of a variety of costs in their hand, and they're choosing how to sculpt this sort of sequencing. When your opponent has 5 land, and then they use a cryptic command and still have 1 left, that is not the time to play Boros Charm in a format where people play Spell Snare.
Oh, you're just asking for it.
Right, that's the time to play Riftbolt. Hard cast your Riftbolt.
Yeah, well, here's the things that you want to do. I think that there are, 3 important points that you might want to know if you're trying to resolve burn cards against a counterspell-heavy blue deck in Modern. One would be know when to cast your spells during their upkeep, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if you're casting your spells during your upkeep, typically your agenda is you don't want your spell to resolve, but you don't want them to make any forward movement on their turn, right? If you cast their spells on their end step, that's because you're like in a devil's bargain situation, which is either they'll stop your spell, but then you have an opening to cast something meaningful on your turn, or they don't stop your spell, and then you have an opportunity. Then you can just kind of rinse and repeat next turn, right? You're doing a little bit of incremental forward momentum. And then the other one, which is very subtle, I think people don't necessarily know this one very well, especially based on the description that you just had of people who have 4 or 5 lands in play, is that casting spells in response to them fetching is an important potential tool that you have. Because they actually have a moment where they're down in mana, where there's nothing they can do. Because they can't tap for a land that's not in play. So I think those are three areas where when the opponent has more resources than you, if you kind of learn how to manipulate the resources in a way where you can either cast more spells than they can counter, or get your meaningful stuff to resolve.
I can't tell you how many times I've played games with blue control decks in Modern where I have multiple fetches against a burn deck, and I only break 1 on my opponent's end step to go get a shock land tapped, and I leave the rest still in play. Because I can't afford to go get 3 shock lands at the same time, or I can't afford to put my shields down. Like, I play 1 fetch land, and I perhaps want to draw land. I play a second, or I want to play around Blood Moon or something, right? But if you arrive at a position of having multiple fetch lands, sometimes you only want to break 1 per turn, because you don't want to just break them all at the same time, have all your lands tapped, and your opponent unloads all their burn spells while you're tapped out. But if you do 1 and then let it untap, then 1 and let it untap, and then obviously you always have the option to just go get basics. You also don't necessarily want to commit to ever breaking them. That's one of the other things that's super important to remember against burn, is that the deck thinning of getting a shock land out of your deck is worth not that much. It's worth a little, but it's not that much. The marginal utility of the fetch land in play can sometimes be higher because of the not having committed the 1 life yet. Because there are a lot of times, like, not cracking a fetch land is like getting half of a Zurin Orb. No, it is.
Well, when your opponent's cards do nothing but damage your life total, that's actually, you're getting meaningful slivers of actual cards now.
Yes.
So here's a question. I actually had this happen to me recently playing in a standard tournament. Pacing when you cast your interactive cards is, like, I think one of the most key skills that a Magic player can learn. And the default that I always say, even when you have instants, right? The default, I think, should be to try to cast removal cards on your own turn when you have the most control over what can happen. Rather than, I think, when people have instants, they think of the default should be maybe like at the opponent's end step, during the opponent's combat. And it's correct to play at different times, right? But I'm just saying what the default setting is, I think, is mostly should be on your own turn. But I was in a situation recently where
Well, actually, before we go past that, I do want to speak to that a little. I think that that it is
it is right to save the removal spell for your own turn, even when you're probably just going to kill their guy, more than people realize. Because not just because like the marginal utility of the extra mana isn't always worth very much. It could be worth something, but it isn't always worth very much. You know what is often worth more than people give credit to is knowing what cards you're going to draw for the turn. Like when you have 9 land in play and you use if you cast a lightning bolt on your opponent's end step, it is very likely that you have done nothing for impacting the amount of mana you have available to you.
Yeah.
And if you would have just waited till your turn, you could have seen what you drew. And even if you're pretty sure you're going to bolt the thing, you don't necessarily know that. And you might not realize when some new piece of information may prompt a new idea in you to play it slightly differently. And even more so, your opponent doesn't know that you would lightning bolt the card no matter what.
So the situation I was in, you know, like I said, my default is to typically use my removal cards on my own turn, but I couldn't because my opponent was playing blue-white flash, and I was like, if I use too much mana on my own turn, and he has a Gideon in his hand, I'm destroyed, right? Like that's I just can't let him get a Gideon. So I'm like, all right, so I'm going to save all my removal cards for his end step, and so that's what I did. And he just like he has a bunch of guys that because he went first, he had the initiative this game, so. And I have like a bunch of good instants. I had Harness Lightning and is it Galvanic? Not Galvanic Blast.
Galvanic Bombardment.
Galvanic Bombardment. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna unload here, and I just got destroyed by Rattle Chains and Spell Quellers. Like, and then I untapped and I had all the mana on my own turn and just nothing to do because I had like unloaded all of my cards at the wrong time.
Yeah, so often the value you're getting from doing things on your opponent's end step is that you then get to untap. So if you're going to choke your opponent on mana, where you use all your mana, use all their mana, they use their mana, you use your mana, and they win the fight, but you get to untap. Sometimes you go Wrath of God and you kill 5 things and you got way ahead. You won the bigger battle. And sometimes that's Gideon, sometimes it's Wrath of God, sometimes it's whatever, right? They won the initial battle, but you win the war because then you get to untap and they can't fight back. Comboing off, sometimes you fight over something in your opponent's end step, but then they win the fight over it, however you get to untap and do something awesome. The thing is that it's not always about mana. Sometimes it's about a single key battle, and sometimes it's about just getting the most you can out of each of your cards. If you cryptic command, their cryptic command, of your cryptic command, of their cryptic command, of your draw 3, and then you end up tapped out and they have stuff that they can cast, but none of it is as good as that 7-card swing you just won, it's like, okay, they get an advantage, a nice little, on their turn, they're able to play a couple cards that are good, but they don't win the game. You're up 7 cards. Now you've already won. Now you have such a big advantage. The key is figuring out what is important. Sometimes what is important is a single battle over Gideon. Sometimes what is important is having the most total amount of resources like Spell Quellers and Rattle Chains or cards from Cryptic Command or Thirst for Knowledge. But it's figuring out what is important in a game, whether it's a specific key battle or your life total or your opponent's life total, and it can change over the course of the game. But that I think is something that needs to be part of the equation of when are you trying to fight on your opponent's end step versus your own.
I think that's an important, very, very important thing to understand when discussing this principle. But I would just add to that one thing, which is that the worst situation for you is if you're trying to use removal cards during the opponent's turn, especially if you're trying to use it during opponent's combat, and then the way that they stop your removal card not only stops the fact that your removal card happens, like you don't get to remove their creature, but then something even worse happens, right? So let's say like your plan is to, shock a 2/2 creature, but they have a blossoming defense. Like, it's not just that they countered your shock, but you take 2 more damage because of when it happened. Versus if you did it on your own turn and they had a blossoming defense, yeah, your shock or your Tarfire or whatever gets countered, but at least you didn't take the damage from the blossoming defense.
Great point. It's like if somebody fireballs you and you cast Safe Passage, now they can't even attack.
Oh, that's so bad.
Right, but if you just attack first, if you know you're going to attack and the attack kills them, then they have to use their Safe Passage to stop themselves from dying from your attack. And then your fireball you still have in your hand for next turn.
Bank a fireball for the future.
Or worse, if you proactively incinerate them and they cast Safe Passage, you can't attack at instant speed. But if you would have just attacked first and they cast Safe Passage, you could have incinerated them in response.
Provided the incinerate kills them, yeah.
Right. What I mean is that sometimes you'll have a choice between 2 threats, and one of them is sorcery speed and one of them is an instant. And sometimes the answers that people would use to stop either one would stop both. But if you play the sorcery first, then you can respond to their answer with the instant.
Yep.
Anyway, man, good stuff. Good chats today. It's been fun.
Very, very interesting and I think hopefully a good episode. So, are you doing Turkey Day stuff today?
If today is Thursday, this timeline, yes.
For purpose of this podcast.
Yep. Enjoying times with family, and hopefully this weekend friends, and my awesome girlfriend Sarah and her family, and we're going to be in Kansas City.
I got to meet Sarah 2 weeks ago. I can attest that she is in fact awesome. My parents came in for effectively yesterday for purpose of the podcast.
Wait, did they storm in and out? Like swoop in, out? Like you're done?
No.
The whole weekend.
Yeah, then they'll be here for the weekend. We're, I don't know, probably
awesome.
Eat, maybe go see a show. So, super
Good
thankful for having a couple days off for me, and thankful for all of our listeners. And thanks for what is this? This is literal 2 years now.
Dude, give my best to my 3 favorite Floreses.
Michael, Jay, and Flores will get.
No, I was thinking actually Bella, Clark, and Catherine.
I knew that's what you meant. So
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
So, thanks to all you guys for listening. And we're Top Level Podcast.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Patreon, YouTube, all that. Download everything.
We are Top Level Podcast. That little iTunes icon on the website or in your feed. If there's one thing I'd actually be very thankful for you to do is if you just go to iTunes and subscribe. That would be bonzer for us.
All right, rad, awesome, man. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend to all you guys. Take care.
Life didn't work so great. Tried to play dredge for jail or hate. Ghostly prison waiting for my untapped phase. Your core trapped in amber stasis state. Lost a lot of friends, got left behind.